Hi everybody. I had to switch on my mic there. And let me know if I'm okay in the chat. Give me an old 5x5 there if you can. Or an old "you're grand, we can hear you." I'm very chilled tonight. I don't know if I'd call myself low energy. Don't know if I'd quite say that about myself. Cool. How's everybody? Hope you all had a good weekend. You know what? I won't stay long tonight because it's a little bit late. And sure, you know yourself, it being a Monday and all that, yeah, you know, you don't want to stay up late. So I have a few things I kind of want to talk about tonight, but it's a little bit on the looser side, to be honest, subject wise. So let me see. Oh, so yeah, I just kind of wanted to start by having a ramble about American Factory, which I know some of you in the chat might have seen anyway, and some of you might have seen it. I tweeted it out, and Way of the World, he's a YouTuber I wasn't aware of until recently. He did a video on it, a kind of a review, you could say, of that film. And so I saw his review, and then I went on to watch it. The documentary is on Netflix itself, and I watched it on Saturday. American Factory, yeah. And the funny thing is now I'm kind of streaming, and I've realized my mistake, which is that you should really watch the film. If you're not going to take notes like I haven't, you should really watch it like directly before talking about it. Because part of me is like, I watched it a couple of days ago. I'm like, yeah, that's good. But just to try and sum it up my thoughts on it, I don't know. Okay, so just to briefly explain what it's about. In Dayton, Ohio in 2012, or maybe it was 2016, 14, doesn't particularly matter. A GM plant was shut down, GM, the car manufacturer. And that plant was shut down for a couple of years, thousands of jobs lost in the area, one of the best gigs in town kind of thing, good paying, blue collar job. And again, you can check Way of the World's review. It's a lot better than I'm summing it up. But yeah, so that factory closed down. A couple of years later, this other company comes in making car windshields. This, I think it was called Fuyo, this Chinese company. And basically what happens is it's the company opens up and hires local workers and all of that kind of stuff at much less pay, but at the same time, people are happy to take whatever job they can get. So people take their jobs. And as the time goes by, a lot of tension starts to emerge between the fact that it's Chinese owned and American staffed for some of the part, and a lot of the middle managers and all of that are Chinese. And then there's a big, huge dispute about whether they should be able to form a labor union or not. So they have to work a lot harder, unfair conditions, unsafe conditions. Their pay is much lower than it used to be. They're basically working in Chinese standards, and it's just, the film was made by two kind of first off, Barack and Michelle Obama's like production company was involved in making it, so credit where it's due to them. But it's an extremely important film. Funnily enough, for advancing the cause of like anti-globalism. When I feel humbled when I see a film like that, because the people who made that documentary are like, I don't know what they are, like politically or whatever. It's a married couple who made the film, but or the documentary. They're not necessarily right-wing nationalist, political activists and all of that, but they've done more for my cause than I ever will, just by making that documentary. And I just think it's important for our kind of thing to take advantage of things like that. It's a very scary prospect. That it's basically the idea of, I don't know, think about maybe the 90s or whatever. I'm just looking at Wolfhound here, and I'm wondering, is Wolfhound a mod? No. Yeah, add moderator. There you go. But the idea that like in the 80s and 90s, after the WTO opened up to China and all of that they became this factory for the world, which in a certain way was good for the West. Well, I would say it wasn't, but there was, for a certain interest, there was a benefit to it. And it's the idea that China has now risen as a kind of a power, and no longer are they just the manufacturing hub that kind of takes in this foreign direct investment from abroad or tries to have its market opened up. Now they're trying to open up our markets. They're trying to invest in our capital and our industries. And now they are the ones opening the factories in the West and hiring us. And, if that worked out well, then maybe you could argue for it in a certain way. But if it doesn't work out well, then it's not good, is it? And 2 seconds now. Okay. I just want to sign out of my Twitter before I start screen sharing, just for best practice here. Because I don't want to be sharing anything, people's details or any of that kind of stuff. Sorry, bear with me. I know I'm kind of chilled tonight, very much so. But just kind of, she be the way it is. Let me see now. So yeah, I just wanted to do that just because, you thank me for it if I don't want to be sharing anyone else's stuff. So yeah, safety first, Chopper says. Exactly. But this it's a very, very scary thing. You see the Chinese people who work there, they take on more and more Chinese staff. They fire at the start. They have these traitorous kind of upper management who are Western, who are American, who are just kind of bootlickers for their Chinese overlords, basically. And then as time goes by, that upper and middle management gets fired and replaced with Chinese anyway. So now you just have all the lower level, the kind of ordinary workers in the plant are now ruled over directly by these Chinese managers. And this is a point I don't mean to rehash Way of the World's video too much, but he did point this out, and I agree with him. It's one of the most astounding aspects of this film is some of these American workers who from this plant go to the Chinese plant over in Shanghai or wherever it is, and all of the Chinese guys are wearing suits, and they're all trad, and it's like they're trad / authoritarian cult, like 1984 type stuff, but at least they're wearing suits and they're kind of sharp, and the Americans are like wearing cargo pants and t-shirts, and they're all massively fat, and it's so embarrassing. Again, it is like seeing a dying civilization on screen, and it's so embarrassing. And just to see how much, again, it's half of the Chinese thing is kind of like you're going, I wouldn't want to be and this is the dichotomy, I think, with China. Our view, or my view anyway, of China is that in one, I'm half of me is terrified by the prospect of a Chinese hegemony, and terrified of like if I were Chinese myself living in their country, being subject to that system would be terrifying and very displeasing or whatever. So that's one half of me, is I'm kind of revolted by it and I don't like it. Then the other half of me is kind of jealous of it, because to some extent you have to envy their tradition, their kind of their belief in themselves. That is one thing that cannot be questioned in this film or just in general, is that for all their and they are exploited as well, because they work for like 16-hour days and this and that, and they can't see their children. Their children live in there's a lot of documentaries about this. Their children live off home in the rural hinterland somewhere, and they work in a city, and it's just not feasible for them to have their families with them because of costs and price and stuff. So they will see them once or maybe twice a year, and the Chinese New Year, maybe second time if they're lucky. So it's completely atomized in that sense. And, people I know are always talking about atomization and all of that. So there's no point worshipping the Chinese model, because they are being completely atomized by this. So it's bad. They are exploited. I feel sorry for them, and they don't know how to anything better. And I am a believer in as we get more technologically, someone's giving me a 5x5 now, thank you. But as we get more technologically proficient with all of these machines that can do the labor of more people, I am a believer that if that can create leisure time for people to have freedom to pursue their own interests a bit more, i.e. more weekend, more this, more that, a reduction in having to the work, then that's a good thing. I don't think there's anything like inherently noble about having to do the 9 to 5, for people. If you can reduce that on people, great. So I don't like the Chinese model, that they're just basically used really, really hard and being ridden really hard by their leadership. But at the same time, China are, I've always felt like, the whole idea that people say China will become a hedge, like the global superpower, and overtake the US. People argue about the date, 2030, 2040, whatever, Some would argue it's kind of underway already in a certain sense. Depends whether you're looking at military or economics or this or that, or, technology or whatever, soft power. But it is probably going to happen anyway. That's generally agreed on, or at least very likely. And I've always felt that when that happens for China, they will thoroughly deserve it. They will have earned it because they've gone through since, excluding Mao, let's start that, Deng Xiaoping, in the 80s or whatever, when China became the world's factory. And when I say they is an amorphous blob. I mean, they, through the work of the people forced by their leaders, whatever, as a combined unit, even though they're not the same thing, the leadership and the workers, they have worked their arses off for this. It's the idea that you look at Britain with children in coal mines and all of this for decades and ages throughout the Industrial Revolution. And out the other end of it came this middle class, large middle class, and this kind of modern, humanistic, not even humanistic, but like a welfare state, a safety net, a decent standard of infrastructure and environmental safety, all of the niceties. And Britain went through it, and most of the West went through it in its own way. And China has gone through it now for what? Pushing on 50 years now. And they've, how many people have lived and died working 16-hour days in a factory, not seeing their family and all of that. I have to give the devil its due and say these guys deserve, and I'm not talking about Xi Jinping, just the average person in China deserves to win out in this, in a certain sense. They deserve, from their perspective at least, to enter that middle class kind of world and take a break. You could say as well that the point of people living and dying, maybe because there's a lot of people would have been born, became of working age, and died throughout this period. So they've given their entire life to it. Textiles and this and that, and making stuff for us, cheap stuff for us. And so that their children could have a better future. It's the classic, dream or whatever for intergenerational contract. I don't know how aware the average Chinese person was of this, but I imagine that was the general tenor of things. You work hard now, and the deal from the leadership is that we will always make things better. And no society is beyond being overthrown, no matter how manipulated or intimidated the people are. If China started to shrink or was shrinking constantly, then this wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have been able to persuade people to do it. So to some extent, as exploitative and as authoritarian as it was, there was ultimately underneath all of this some kind of contract operating between the people and the leadership. And to be fair, I think both sides have fulfilled and continue to fulfill their own ends of the bargain. And that's not me simping for China at all. Like I said, I'm horrified by the prospect of a Chinese-dominated world, to be honest. Because even when they get that middle class, I don't think they're just going to turn into Europe suddenly with all this kind of humanity and all of this. I don't think that's quite going to happen. They still have a different society, different model of society than we do. But so that's one side of it, is like they deserve what they get. And that is a thing you see is like, again, I'm so torn watching this film, because on one side, the Chinese workers are like privately talking about how slow their American counterparts are, how pampered they will feel like they need to be, and all of this stuff. They kind of laugh, they look down their noses at it. At one point, they say, we are better than them. They don't hide their nationalism, their supremacist nationalism, one bit. And again, part of me goes, I can't deny that that's true. You look at the film and you go, yeah, these Americans are completely soft. And Westerners, all of us probably included by comparison. I can only speak for myself, but So that's one side of it, but the other part of me then looks at it and goes, no, 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 don't glorify these Chinese just because they work their tails off, work themselves to the bone for the the benefit of billionaires and all of these leaders. Which it's not like they get paid a massive amount. Again, if these Chinese workers are doing such good work, then why can't they? And this is in this film documentary as well. Then why can't they have a 3-bedroom house with their children living in one place and all of that? They could at least be rewarded with that. So it's a cruel system. So I'm torn. I'm torn again between saying China is on. I half admire what they're doing, and I half despise it and fear it and all of that. And here's the key point. You might say, well, how does this tie together? It ties together because what this film is ultimately pointing out through the microcosm example of this one factory is that China isn't just being China anymore. The West and the rest of the world effectively is being Chinafied. And the boomerang has come back the other way. And they're starting to get a lot of power. How they were even able to open this plant and get all of this done is unreal. And they want to bust up unions. And it's ultimately a conversation about globalism too, because again, it's the breaking down of these global barriers. It kind of breaks up trade union power, worker power, and it's a sad thing to behold. But again, China will deserve it. China, at the end of the day, as China becomes more powerful, they will look after themselves in their own way because they have a racial, cultural. I don't want to use the word supremacist because that's a kind of a dirty word, but it's kind of like, what would you say? Strong in-group preference to themselves. So they will look after themselves. And the fact that we're outward looking, it's really sad to see. And I wonder what they make of it. I know that political actors in China, because there are some sharp propagandists and stuff at work in the West and back in China, who have picked up on this whole thing of preying on the racist thing in the West. They know how to use that card. But it's just such a worrisome thing. And I'll tell you the takeaway for me watching this documentary, and I hope you watch it if you don't, or if you haven't seen it already, you go watch it. My takeaway was that, you could argue, I could make a stream with a bunch of papers and a bit of evidence, like, oh, I saw this, fact or that fact. And the Irish Times could publish a thing about a certain controversy or whatever, You could have different types of media, and they're all little bits and kind of tidbits of the story about China and the West. Let's say something about that. Oh, China did something controversial in Ireland here, or this or that, or what do they call them? Daigo, who basically do parallel trading from the West over to China. You can check out the AVD China guys for that. But you could find these controversies or whatever. But what I found particularly compelling about this documentary is that it's all encompassing. It tells a real story. It's whatever, an hour and a half long, 2 hours long, and it shows everything in one piece. It shows the weight of what's happening, the big picture, as well as the small made up of little pictures throughout the documentary, but ultimately as one whole piece. Excuse me. It shows the big picture. You can see and you don't need to be a politically savvy, politically aware, educated person. Anyone from very informed to not very informed to whatever can just watch this documentary, and it says it all. It's self-contained. And my feeling being, Connor Lockman asks me what's the documentary. It's called American Factory. So my take on having anyone who has seen this whole documentary, particularly leadership people in the West, if they care about the West at all, which I don't think they do, but if they did, how could anyone? Basically, my point is that let's say you're in a leadership position in Ireland and you have some sway over the idea of whether we accept a lot of Chinese investment or we don't, right? Investment. And say I get that person and I sit them down in front of a TV and I get them to watch that documentary. And then it's over and then I switch off the TV and I go, so what's your take? And there's 3 takes someone could have from that. They could say, well, it tells me that courting Chinese investment is perfectly okay, or it is absolutely to be avoided like the plague. It's toxic and there's no going back from it, and it's extremely dangerous. or they could say it's somewhere in between. You could kind of roll the dice with some of it and kind of tailor it to make sure you're kind of trying to control it here and there. You're staying on top of it. You're kind of winning as you do it. Those are the three options. There's a kind of nah, it's fine. Yeah, it's terrible. Avoid it. Or there's the kind of let's take an in between approach. Now, I don't see how anyone could watch that documentary, which is a factual thing. It's not some kind of fiction or opinion. How anyone could watch that one piece of work and not and have any conclusion, but we need to stay absolutely wide of this investment for any good that it can bring. It's a poison chalice and it's a dangerous thing. So we need to stay completely wide of it. Let's just not do it. It's not the only gig in the world. Economies can be run one of several ways, whatever. But either way, whatever way we do things, let's just stay away from that. At least for 10 or 20 years, let's just let the world play along on this very contentious and dodgy issue. Let I would say let England keep going as it is. Let France, let America. Let's just see how that goes, and let's just hang back and watch. And of course, if you did that, then 20 years go by, I think we'll know. But I just don't see how you could make any other decision, because it's just like China are going to envelop, a lot of our. In a way, I've kind of said my piece there. I've kind of lost my train of thought slightly, but it's just there's nothing to gain from it. There's short term. We have this Wuxi pharmaceutical plant in Dundalk at the moment, big investment and all of that kind of stuff. But again, it's just not worth it. And ultimately, the arguments are there of like, take these windows for example. So in this documentary, the plant makes windshields for cars, and the problem is that between the Chinese way of working more efficiently and better, and maybe they don't go as good in quality or whatever, but they work really efficiently. They can produce cheap because of labor and all of that. And exploitation, they can exploit their labor more. The argument is like, well, the economist would kind of say to me, well, what are you, they would say, okay, that's very idealistic, Garrod, but what are you going to do about it? There's no way around this problem, but straight through it, because if the Americans need their labor standards and all of this, and they're slower and all of this, making these windshields, and they can't handle the presence of this Chinese leadership in Ohio, then put gin in the flask. Someone asked me, no, it's tea. But the alternative to that, having this situation in Ohio, is to just say, okay, well, fine, let's just let the American plant be the American plant with Americans, ran by Americans, owned by Americans, and let the Chinese plant go back and open up in some other Chinese city. They can easily just do it in China, right? They don't need to be in America. And see how that shakes out. Obviously, the Chinese one will be able to produce basically the same windows for whatever, half the cost. And as you have Ford and Subaru and Toyota, whatever, need their windshields, they can get it at a cheaper price. They will buy them all from China, and ultimately the American plant shuts down, and you're back to no jobs. So there is a conundrum there. You have to accept these arguments from these economists of like, well, what are you supposed to do about that? And again, I'm a radical on this because my radical answer to this can only be, maybe I'm just triggered by this documentary, but I feel like I've always had this point of view, is that actually Way of the World comes to the same conclusion at the end of his video. But my thoughts are that, if that is the situation and we can't compete with China on that level because they have a different standard to us, and we don't want to effectively lower ourselves to that standard, because there's a time when we used to be exploited as hard as they are, and then we stopped. But then what happened is that, well, you can't compete with that then because we have all of these rights and these thises and these that. So what are you meant to do? Do we have to kind of slowly disassemble our world, our lifestyle, our standards, everything? Do we have to do all of that just to compete? Well, to me, there is no way around it, and it's an extreme solution. And no, it's not the one you're thinking, Jesus, if whatever you are thinking. But the extreme solution is not war or any of that. Is to just separate the two worlds. As in, I know it's impractical to say, okay, we just completely disconnect from them, our markets and everything. I don't know how that works out. You could say I'm a bit idealistic saying that, but it's like, well, what's the alternative? The person who rejects what I'm saying there has to argue to me how we won't just slide down to China's level until they completely overcome us, and then they have say over all of our affairs in the West and are the ones in the driver's seat. Connor Lockman says cars with no windows. No, but it's the same, I know what you're getting at there, but it's like, different. It's not just car windows, it's all sorts of stuff. It's like, I think you just have to decouple from them, and you just have to be in a situation where you go, okay, well, we have these different standards, fair enough, and we're not going to just try to meet you on your level. But what we will do is we'll make it's a complete FU to globalization. You would have to completely untangle globalization. My solution would be and I don't know how this is a radical solution, but it's the lesser of two evils, I would say, is that you say we make car windows for our cars here, and we make them ourselves in the West, and we buy those car windows from ourselves, a self-contained market, and you make your car windows for your people, whatever. It's none of our business, but we make our car windows for our car companies, and that's it. And there's plenty of us here. There's the North America, Europe, potentially Russia. I don't know. You could hash all that out, try to figure it out. But basically, a kind of a parity of Western countries that both have similar economic standards and all of that, but also similar cultural values. And I don't know, does this sound like some kind of pan-Western state? I'm not getting into the huge politics and the theory and the this and that. I'm just saying, this is very loosely speaking. You basically, you do, compared to China, you have North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, blah, 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 the West. The West to just self-contain and just say, fine, we make it this way. And by the way, if you want to buy our windshields, you can buy them. But we're not buying yours, and we're just not doing that. Our market is completely 100% geared up to our interests all the time. And that's all. And that's what China does. That is exactly what China does. Someone mentions the Belt and Road Project, and everything they do is in their interests, at least in the longer term. They think in 100-year periods, 500-year periods. I'm not making that up. That's a known thing. Generally, they think long term, but we don't. So again, it's just, you have this slide happening in the West. You watch this documentary and you see what's going on. It's obviously wrong, but there's nobody there at the wheel to kind of manage it and say, okay, pull the brakes on this, stop. There was a time when you had statesmen, I would say early 20th century, maybe at some point during the 20th century and before that, where people saw civilizational things happening and thought, if I want to have blue collar workers in my homeland be able to work and have a job that they can kind of have for life, or at least if it's taken, there would be swap overs for it, and to sustain a kind of a healthy economy and society, a productive and reproductive society, people knew that you had to do things like this, a protectionist state. And actually, to be honest, I'm not much of a neocon or any of that. I'm not talking about wars necessarily or whatever, but there was a time when people thought at that big civilizational level, if you need to take your enemy down a peg in some way or another, you take the legs out from under them. And ultimately, we look back at history and think, oh, these things were very wrong. But maybe it's worth reappraising certain aspects of history and thinking, well, was it wrong ultimately? Or was it a zero-sum game where there's an element of them or us? And I'm not as cruel as that. I don't think it has to be 100% zero-sum them or us. There's an element to that. And if you think I'm wrong, ask the CCP, ask the Chinese leadership. They know that. The Chinese people all know that. It's very clear to them. So it's not like some understanding I've just come up with. And yet what shocks me is that from viewing this documentary and just in general with all of this, it seems like, well, I could say that we don't have anyone at the wheel, I don't want to say father figure. I don't know, people will criticize me for that, but a kind of a statesman or a class of people whose first interest all the time is our society, and not just for the next 4 years, but for the next 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. You need put no limit on the future we look towards. And yet we don't. And I would say we don't have that. But not only that, we have the exact opposite. We have the worst. We have people who are actively engaged and propping themselves up. Their status elevation is through how much they can open us up, how much they can kind of sell us out. Sell out is a bit of a tired cliche term, but like how much they can open us up, and there's always a payment ultimately in it. A bit of investment here or a bit of this there, a bit of short-term kind of expediency in some of these things. And all of our media institutions, our political leadership, our business leaders are all on the sell here with this thing. And they're effectively, like I always say, a fire sale of our civilization, of our country, of our state, in little chunks and pieces all over the place. And it's pretty bad. So that is ultimately, you look at a lot of stuff happening in society at the moment, but sometimes it's good to zoom out to the civilizational level as well. Now, I don't like doing that all the time because it's important to think small, think local and stuff. But sometimes I indulge myself in a zoom out and kind of go, fuck, this has to change. We either die on this hill or we die on this kind of moment, or this shift, this Eastern shift that's happening in the world. And ultimately China is the big one. We either fall on that, and we fall on that and it won't come back. It won't just bounce back. It's not like the pendulum, the 4 years of you vote a different way. It's not like, oh, China for this 10 years. Once we lose our position, we lose it forever. And again, or for a long time anyway, in our lifetimes and many more generations to come, we will. And that people think, oh, that's like white privilege. You don't want to lose your white privilege. It's like, no. I don't want to lose. I just these people who would say that are deluded. It's like, no, I don't want to lose the idea that you can unionize, the idea that you protect the environment, that you care for animals, that you are responsible, that basically that you don't exploit humanity to its last. And I just enjoy the Western way. I like it, and I would rather it continue and not go into perpetual decline, as we've seen in the last generation. That generations born now will do, or for the first time in a long time in the West, will do worse than their parents did. That is linked to what is happening at the top, at the macro level. So it's not like, oh, I want to preserve my white privilege because I'm all of this kind of university kind of lecturer stuff. It's very real. It's a lowering of quality of life, big time, and a reduction of our own what we would call civilities and norms. So that's not good. And something needs to be done. And I would just recommend watching that documentary anyway, if you haven't seen it. And if you don't know what I've been on about, or I've been kind of waffling, watch that, and I think you will understand. And also watch Way of the World's video, which is linked beneath. So I've linked it there. I can see Way of the World's kind of review, and then American Factory is on Netflix. Oh, and also I must say, there's a similarity to be drawn as well between American Factory and another documentary called Empire of Dust, which is about a Chinese manufacturer kind of guy in Africa trying to source gravel for his project. And it's a clash of working worlds, how China and Africa just do not compute in terms of the workforce. And it's almost like a tragic comedy or something like that, this Empire of Dust documentary. Again, it would be almost quicker for you to probably watch it than have me try to explain it to you. But there are comparisons to be drawn between Empire of Dust and American Factory. One of the comparisons you could make, because someone could say, well, they're like the same. It's like the Chinese are just dealing with two workforces that are just completely useless. And I would disagree with that, because the African workforce that they're dealing with in Empire of Dust pretty much are useless. There's a lack of trust and reciprocity. There's a lack of any kind of accountability or just kind of word, or like keeping their word, and being able to figure anything out. Anyone who's been in Africa will know that, right? Even the lefties and the no matter how progressive you are, if you've been to Africa for a while and tried to get some stuff done, it can be a little bit of an issue. So that's Empire of Dust. And someone could say, oh, it's like the Chinese are having like the same exasperation in America because of all their fat American colleagues. But it's not so much that. It's more that it's different, because it's like, it's not like Empire of Dust in American Factory. In American Factory, it's that and most of the workers, it seems from the film, they're not willing to be worked to death for 13-hour days, and have no breaks and have safety hazards. A lot of people get injured during this documentary under the Chinese management. It's that kind of stuff. And again, that's a good thing. That is, you can, maybe this makes me a progressive technically or something, but I am a progressive in that sense. Again, an improvement of things. You should only be going in one direction in that sense. That doesn't mean being liberal or whatever, woke or any of that. It's just in terms of the relationship between labor and capital and lifestyle and all of this kind of stuff, in conjunction with tradition, because you need tradition to temper some of these kind of things. But a traditional country doesn't mean more work. Oh, work is noble, work is this and work is that. No, I mean, if people could have, put it this way, if you could make people have a 3-day weekend instead of a 2-day weekend, that would be a better thing. I'm for a constant march in that direction, insofar as it's technically feasible and all of that. Because labor will always be the exploited force compared to capital, compared to bosses, compared to whatever. And I'm not anti-entrepreneur or any of that, or business, but just, they're inherently in the weaker position. So again, I'm always on the side of the person who's in that side of that arrangement. The kind of the Tesco worker instead of the Tesco management, put it that way. So anything that makes the worker in that sense's life better, I'm for. And what we see with this China thing is a dragging down. So it's not that, oh, the Chinese are such good workers and we're such bad. It's no. They're just exploited workers. So again, I'm torn. That documentary had me torn between admiration and envy for China in certain ways, but also a desire to completely keep them at arm's length and keep them out. In a way, it's like we want China well away from us, but we also want to kind of be a bit like China in a certain way, certain regards, I feel. So that's those two things. I did link Empire of Dust down there as well. Now, I don't know how many of you want to. I used to ask you if you want to keep going or not. I'm not going to do that anymore. If because look, if you don't want to watch it, you'll just close the window. But so I was going to have a quick look, and this will be quicker. I ranted way too much on the documentary, really. But do I have a screen share up? Yes, I do. So first off, this is a quick thing. I just want to look at the chat. Did everybody see that post? Give me a 1 if you've seen the really dark in such a layered way I can't fully wrap my head around this kind of nice family Twitter controversy. 1 if you've seen it, 2 if you haven't. I'd be interested to see. I assume everybody's seen this. I don't need to explain it. Yeah. Okay, so everybody's pretty much seen this. So I don't know. I listened to a few podcasts over the weekend, and a lot of people were talking about it. There's a few twos there. So it's this picture of this nice family, and this kind of hipster, whatever person is kind of saying, oh, it's really dark in such a layered way I can't fully wrap my head around. And all of the replies were like, oh, look at these people, they're horrible, and those kids are going to grow up to be psychologically damaged, and they're just so white, and they're so this is how Hitler started, and this is just so toxic, and they're insulting the fact that it's kind of so nice. They're almost saying it's gauche or kind of repressed, or it's kind of almost like the authoritarian personality test made into a kind of a, whoever designed the authoritarian personality test or advocates for that would look at this photo and be like, oh, this reeks of hierarchy and family values and all of this kind of stuff, and kind of this kind of unashamedness and whatever. And there were these dog whistles. Yeah, Morgoth's review. I should have put that in the link, really, to be honest. And in a way, it's why I was kind of reluctant to talk about it, because I listened to Morgoth's review on it. I listened to who else? basically just all of the Twitter dialogue that went on around this, and a few other podcasts and stuff like that. And I kind of feel like, you know, I can't really say anything about this without just kind of saying what other people have said. But it's I don't know, beyond there's a whole white thing, this whole white, and I'm not denying that for a second. That is at the heart of it. There's also as someone has just pointed out here, ugly women hate hot women. Lol, Tom Kelly says. Now that's one way of putting it, but like there is a kind of an envy of, and of course a lot of people went to the original poster's Twitter and searched keywords like depression, and she's like, oh, I'm so depressed, and I kiss my cats in the evening. And even you just look at her face and she looks kind of like, she looks depressed. She looks like physically unwell and kind of, you know, whatever, gray compared to this, you know, lady in this picture and her gorgeous children. But, and so it's a kind of a jealousy and a kind of a nastiness, a hatred of normality and of family. And yes, also of basically this white family, there's a kind of a racial dynamic to it as well. That there's, and again, I'm repeating a kind of a more goth point here, but it's hard not to, because it speaks for itself, is that they kind of, there's a kind of a dangerous element to this white family. There's this idea of a white family having a large white family. And it harkens back to this kind of TV stuff as well. There's this kind of like seventh heaven kind of sickliness. Now, and I did think Seventh Heaven the way it was. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that show or young enough. You know, this kind of like stick up its whole kind of white family, kind of white bread type of thing. There's that kind of whole, and that again itself is just a meme. It's a Hollywood meme. It's a kind of it's a fake meme. No, these families, these are nice families, like, and there is this idea that there's something oppressive and authoritarian and ultimately kind of fascist about a healthy, happy, fecund, kind of white family. They should all be, I don't know, and I don't know. It's kind of hard to express my thoughts. I did just want to bring it up though. It is a very, very poisonous thing, and again, you know, it's like the China thing. You know, you have this this element of internal hatred. Actually, it does come back to the China documentary, because the American Factory. Is because when they take a little trip to the Chinese side of things, they have this, as they tend to do in these Asian countries, these kind of events where they do like all these kids come out and dance and all these people come out, and it's you really need to watch this for yourself, but it's a company thing. So it's kind of like a company event where all of the workers, they even do, people are getting married at this event from the company. So their weddings and everything is integrated into this company mindset, which is the twisted part. But ultimately, the Chinese culture respects a kind of and I don't mean this in the kind of, people will think I'm just like Joseph Mengele stuff, but like, so when they hear the word eugenics, I don't mean eugenic like that or anything. Like there's eugenic and dysgenic, right? And ultimately, Chinese culture does keep some of those eugenic norms. And again, this is not some kind of like Mengele thing. It's more like just normality. Like the majority of history had a kind of eugenic quality to it, that people were paired, not paired, forced paired, but, you know, this kind of the way men and women courted each other and tried to set up a family and all of this, basically some traditional norms. China encourages that all over the place, and this kind of parent respecting, and, you know, this kind of normal things that kind of bound up social relations in the West for forever until quite recently. And China has that going on. And in the West, something so simple by comparison as a picture like this, and this got like 50,000 likes or whatever. This picture by comparison, so China has that and most of the world has that, but in the West, something so simple as a picture like this is a controversial thing. It's a controversial thing. When you look at it, you go, that seems innocuous to me. To me, that seems normal. So again, it's not only us, let's say us versus China, to keep the frame of this kind of video so far, is that China encourages these things, which for all their faults is a healthy thing. They encourage it at all levels of society, from top down, bottom up, whatever. And meanwhile, our problem isn't that we don't encourage it. it's much worse than that. Again, there's 3 levels. There's either we are positive towards it, we're neutral towards it, which would be a complaint I would still make. Oh, we're neutral towards it. That's not good enough. We should be positive like China are towards it, let's say. But no, it's worse than that. We're antithetical towards it. We are antagonistic towards the very thing. We're anti the positive, anti the good, anti-growth, anti-survival, anti-pride, anti-self-interest, anti, and I don't mean self-interest, but we're the opposite of all these things. Basically, unhealthy is the word for it. So actually, I'm quite pleased now that I managed to find a way to tie this picture back to my previous topic, because it does ultimately, the kind of family and the hierarchy and the bonds, societal bonds. Ultimately, family is one of the strongest of those, of course, being strongly and resolutely encouraged in China in the East, and here being slandered, being treated like a demonic thing. Very, very strange, and we're in a bad place if that's the case. So what else do I have? These are just random subjects I'm bringing up here. Oh, what have I got going on here? Oh, there was a point here. Okay, whoops. That's my alt account. Just for I'm going to actually make it easier for the NGO sleuthers. I had this account. Where is it? Okay, I had this account before the sleuthers kind of pause it and go, "We've caught his alt account." I had this alt account ages ago to see what was going on in this NGO world, and I'm actually glad for this. I must do it the next night. I'll put it up because and it was very weak. Like, it's not some kind of alt account I had where it was spanning a lot of the Twitter sphere, and I was working hard on it. Set it up blindly, accessed it about twice ever, right? But it's so funny, me pretending to be this kind of Antifa. It's really weak. It's a lame attempt. But I often looked at it and thought, this is funny. But I will probably set up a new one, even as I've kind of doxed that one. But what did I say? The bio for it was smashes, loves, hates fascists, loves Simpson memes and Chahan, which is like a Asian dish or something like that. So I had to put myself in the mindset of these guys. Anyway, where am I at? There was a tweet I wanted to bring up for you lads there, but I signed out of my Twitter and obviously it won't let me access it now. So it's about this labor thing, labor and anti-Semitism. There's recently been this report came out, and it's really long, so I haven't gone through it at all. It's hundreds of pages long. But what it seems to have exposed is that, like, there was all sorts of cloak and dagger stuff going on against a lot of labor people in the last couple of years with this anti-Semitism purge. And I've never known what to make of this. I used to always be like looking at the news headings for this stuff, being like, I keep hearing about the anti-Semitism. Where are the people that say they don't like Jews? I assume that's what anti-Semitism is. But then you go to the accusations against Corbyn and all of this, and it's like, he framed Israel in this kind of way and said this and that, which compares to this, and which if you unwrap it, it means this and all of that. And I'm just going, listen, this is, if you need 20 minutes to explain to me why something was anti-Semitic, then you're like, this is silly. And I don't know what was behind this whole purge or whatever, but it happened. And this report has come out detailing some of basically how this purge happened and what it was all about. I only looked at the introduction, because again, the introduction is long enough in and of itself. The rest, you can see here, we're talking like 800, 900 pages. But there are just a few bits I wanted to kind of focus on. Here's one thing that just caught my eye, was where have we got? Page 13. Well, there's a lot to it, actually. Can you see this, by the way? Yeah, you can. So the events which led to this investigation, including the party becoming host to a small number of members holding views that were unarguably hostile to Jewish people, and in some cases, frankly, neo-Nazi in their nature, are deeply disturbing. And this caused great pain, Oh, actually, I like the intro as well. Again, Labour have gone very far from their roots, it seems. The Labour Party exists to, I'll highlight this just for those who aren't picking up on it. The Labour Party exists to champion equality and fight discrimination and prejudice. These aims are not secondary to any wider goals of the party. They are fundamental to its purpose. I found that was a very interesting way of phrasing it. It exists to champion equality, to fight discrimination and prejudice. These aims are not secondary; these are fundamental to its purpose. I don't know. That's a dangerous thing, when your party becomes all about this outgroup preference, ethnic stuff, and gender and trans and blah 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 blah. You very much lose the whole idea of making the working man's and the average man and the lower classes and all of that, even the underclass, the kind of welfare class and all that, improving their lot and how would you say, uplifting people where you can against the powers that be in our society via capital, big capital, and all of that. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing to get lost in this endless intersectionality mumbo jumbo stuff, and the two, can very often be weaponized against each other. I think that in a sense they can actually be mutually exclusive, because we look at something like immigration, for example, and just as they can be accused of some anti-Semitism on trumped up reasons, they can be accused of racism if they became a little bit anti-immigration, for example. So it's like, a party should have a clear focus on what it actually is all about, and a party that is all about this stuff is not going to help its English working class voters very much. I'm looking at the chat here. I don't know, is someone saying I do get interested when I see a bit of who's X. You feel like you're talking in class. I don't know. And also Manic Street says civic nationalist nonsense. Is that, I'm just curious, Manic Street, is that me or is that the Labour thing? Civic nationalist nonsense, because I got accused of that on Millennial Woes as well. Not by Millennial Woes, but by and not even by most people, just by a few people in the chat and stuff who were like losing their marbles because I made 1 or 2 points. I was a civic nationalist. I'm just interested in whether I'm coming across that way now. Oh, Labour, yeah. Well, Labour, civic nationalist, yeah. I mean, that's that's putting it lightly. They're barely nationalist at all, I would say, not to mind civic or otherwise. But here's the bit that, so it's page 13, and it is paragraph, like, yeah. So it's the anti-Semitic views thing. This, I found this very interesting. It's some of those who joined expressed anti-Semitic views, sometimes framed in terms of support for the Palestinian people, but incorporating traditional tropes about Jewish power and influence. The exploitation of social media has given these unacceptable views far greater exposure than they would have had 15 or 20 years ago. The internet has now contributed to the growth and sharing of conspiratorial theories about a shadowy global elite, often tending towards anti-Semitism. Now, my thing here is like, people talk about this Jewish thing and stuff like that, and it's like, I now both have like the way out there nationalists and the NGO people, you can hear a pin drop. How's he going to land himself in a hole? I refuse to land myself in a hole and all of that stuff, right? With sound bites or whatever, right? So, but my point is that you don't need to be all jumped up on this Jews are this and that and this and that as like this big thing you think about all the time or whatever. You don't need to be at that level of anything to just read into the basic contradiction here, which is like, okay, so incorporating traditional tropes about Jewish power and influence. Again, if that is a problem endemic in the Labour Party that needs to be purged, what did Keir Starmer say? Like ripped out, or this virus, all of this very intense language, right? If that's such a bad thing, and again, what they're talking about is not people saying I hate Jews or this or that, right? Which is another thing the algorithm is going to love me saying. But it's not about saying that. What they're talking about is people leaning towards tropes that seem a certain way or whatever. So it's people making like light inferences of certain things that are being perceived a certain way by the people writing this report. But again, if the trope is that people are talking about Jewish power and influence, that there's Jewish power and influence, I mean, what about white privilege? Like, what if Labour were to take the very same stance And what if Labour were to take? Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. If Labour were to take the very same stance on the white privilege narrative, the idea, what is it? Tropes about white power and influence, about white privilege, about white, all this kind of stuff, right? Supremacy and blah blah blah, and power at the top in the CEO boardroom and all of this stuff. Again, those two things could be just as easily, equally applied to Jewish and white people, right? Some people would argue even more to the former. But either way, it's like both groups have a lot of influence in high places, for various reasons. You know what I mean? The whole idea of like, oh, the white boardroom and stuff like that. That is very much less the case these days because of various initiatives that have been taken. But generally speaking, there's some truth to that, right? There's no point denying. Yeah, and there's justification for it. It's not discrimination or any of that. It just is a thing. Equally with Jewish representation. So the two could be interchangeable. And again, on one side, you'll have people saying, no, you can't say that. On the other side, the more nationalist side, they'd be saying, oh, it's not equal. You know, I don't want to get into that, like trying to quantify it. I'm just saying you could swap the two out. At the very least, swap the two out, right? That's just at the very least, you could do that. So why can't we have the same conversation of expunging from the Labour Party tropes about there being power and influence and white privilege and all of this stuff? Because after all, it should be the one you probably focus on more, because it is a country of British people. So more of the Labour Party are affected by this and insulted by this stuff on a daily basis. Like they said up here at the top, the very bad things. This has caused great pain to the Jewish community in this country, including Jewish members of the Labour Party. How about this has caused great pain to English community in this country, the Indigenous English community in this country, including Indigenous English members of this Labour Party, who are completely stomped all over. But again, no. So it cuts to the heart of the problem with Labour at the moment. The fact that whether it's being anti-Brexit, which a lot of Labour Party people voted for, this kind of white working class they always talk about, and the whole thing of like white, villainy, which these working class people are like, what? And all of this, and the fact that is what's going on. That is the most discriminated group in England at the moment, even though it's their country, and yet they are being hauled over the coals for this kind of made-uppy apparent problem that Labour had. I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting how Labour react to this, the Labour grassroots, because I don't know, will the Keir Starmer thing go on forever? They replaced Corbyn with a Taylor's dummy, a new Tony Blair type figure, who is going to weed out all of this supposed anti-Semitism, and probably institute kind of mostly neoliberal policies. I don't know. It's not going to last forever, and especially actually the ethnic kind of the woke ethnic minorities and stuff will only make it more difficult for Labour in a way, and then the white constituent, which is the majority of the Labour Party, will get pissed off with this as well. This has a limiting factor to it. It can only go on so long, before people just go, this is bullshit. We want our party back. We want better conditions, blah, blah, blah. But England has that problem again, that people defect to the Tory party, and the Tory party aren't great either. I don't know what they can quite do about that, because Tories will just ride in on the whole idea that Corbyn's an extremist. I don't know. It's a media thing. It's a problem. And I don't know about Corbyn. Corbyn was like an out-group preference scumbag as well. So it's a bit of a shit show, this kind of duopoly type of thing. It really catches people in a big 22, a catch 22. In terms of, ultimately, and some people disagree with this, some people here probably, but it does come back to the whole idea of an alliance between some of the anti-woke left and the kind of the nationalist right and stuff like that. There is room to be forged, and a thing like that, if you could get it going, would be mad powerful and mad attractive. There'd be a lot of kinks to be worked out, and a lot of compromises would have to be made. But if something like that could be made, it would be extremely powerful. But that would be difficult. So the final thing I have is the Conor McGregor thing. Yeah, the fact that this guy who was like working for, I always say regime communications. I must do a video on this itself. I call it regime comms. You know, this people who are like basically communications PR managers for the regime, via journalism, via this, via that, and they kind of stick up for the central tenets of the kind of liberal regime in this country and other countries. And Conor McGregor was being kind of smart alecked by this Stena Lines person. They were arguing about, basically, if you haven't been following this, then I probably can't really catch you up here. But if you know what McGregor was doing with trying to get the borders closed and all of this, and this kind of smart aleck Stena Line rep was being smart with him via the Stena Line account. His name was Simon, and Conor found out that this guy works for so he works for RTE Pulse. So he works for RTE, but he's also the comms guy, literally comms, regime comms for Stena Line. And I'm telling you, just every time you look at these guys, you find that they are effectively regime comms. I mean, I use it as a figure of speech, but it often actually turns out to be true. Like this guy has got 1 foot in RTE, 1 foot in Stena Lines, which is fine as it is. But then, of course, he comes out against Conor's implicitly nationalist crusade here, smart alecky, trying to defend the government's point of view. He sounds just like Simon Harris or Fergal Bowers, another regime's comm person. He sounds just like them, the same line of like, oh, well, we need medical equipment and we need essential medical personnel. This kind of obfuscation from the fact that, well, that's all well and good, but why can't we just shut down the non-essential stuff then? And they've yet to answer that. And they all use that same line of obfuscation. You see it via the government, via the kind of cooked regime media. And then this Stena Line guy, who you would think would have no reason to give the regime line, but he is giving the regime line. And lo and behold, it turns out, works for RTE Pulse and does comms literally at Stena Line. And is also he's also a Brit. It's funny, Conor called him a little egg with a Ronnie. I was like, is that some figure of speech? I don't know. And then I saw the guy. I was like, I get it. But yeah, so that was Conor. So keep your eyes peeled for Conor. I've been making that point quite a bit recently, and his overtures are most welcome. So anyway, I've kept you long enough, and I've kind of rambled here or there. I was a little bit all over the place tonight, kind of talking about one thing and another. Going to shut down the screen now. Get to just my face. Hello. I'll basically leave it there. Thanks for joining me. Thanks, Wolfhound. You've been here all along, and I've made you a mod, and I appreciate you being here, and all the rest of you lads as well. So it's late now. I'm probably going to hit the hay, I'd say. So I'll basically say goodbye to you all, and all that jazz. So end broadcast. Yeah, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.